Good afternoon. Good afternoon, panelists. Good afternoon, persons who are here with us in the audience, persons who are here with us online. I also would like to acknowledge colleagues, staff, students who are here with us in this panel, our specially invited guests who are also here to have the conversation on cannabis use, and also our support staff, and I want to welcome and also acknowledge the media who are here with us this afternoon, and other persons who are interested in this topic on cannabis use among young persons. And I really just want to be very brief, but to start by saying that as a head of department in behavioral sciences, we have had several students just sharing their concern of being on campus and of hearing about cannabis, of being offered, perhaps being introduced, but not being aware of what exactly are they part of and what they've been introduced to. So part of my motivation really is about the sensitization that must happen along this issue of cannabis use. But the other part is about equipping students, persons with the knowledge that they could use, I think, to make the decisions that are best suited for them individually. Recognizing, of course, that no two persons are impacted the same way by what they consume. Anything is, whether it be cannabis or substance alcohol use, for example. But the reality is, and I think this is something that we have to take forward as an institution, part of our job is about sensitizing, it's about motivating, it's about changing, it's about being advocates for so many things. Not just knowledge dissemination, but advocates for change, advocates for protection of those who may be most vulnerable in the process. But we cannot, if there's one thing that as an institution we cannot do, is to sit down and remain silent. And I remember the words of Gerard, who said that your silence will not protect you. And from those words, I am strengthened and motivated more so to host this multidisciplinary panel this afternoon. And our panelists really, and I'm very big on multidisciplinary collaboration and work and thought and discussion. And if there's one thing we all know, is that thinking of anything from one perspective is always limited. So we have with us this afternoon the perspective of a sociologist, a psychiatrist. We have one person from the law, with the law, Dr. Professor Clement, who's in pharmacology. Thank you for that. And certainly I do believe we have members from the audience staff who are across multiple disciplines and who can also share, because we are all part of the conversation. And I want to leave on that note that this is a conversation, but the ultimate rationale is for us to sensitize, to share, to discuss, and to serve as major advocates to protect and also to serve. And with that, I invite our chair to start the proceedings. Thank you all.
A warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this very special event on cannabis and young people. And I want to give a hearty thank you to our brilliant and inspirational head of department, Dr. Tyehimba, who has really been leading by example in terms of making the university and the department more relevant to addressing the range of social issues that confront us in Trinidad and Tobago. This afternoon we have an exciting and esteemed panel to talk about different aspects of cannabis in Trinidad and Tobago. And I would maybe want to start by acknowledging the passing away of one of the sociologists and leading scholars on cannabis, the history of cannabis in Trinidad and Tobago, who is Dr. Peter Hannemanse, who passed away a couple of years ago. And his scholarship really shed some important light in terms of the emergence of cannabis in Trinidad and Tobago, the diverse ways that it was used, and some of the ways that anti-cannabis legislation was used as a means of control by the colonial authorities. So this afternoon we have an esteemed panel, which includes Dr. Joni Lee Pow, Mr. Rajiv Persad, Senior Counsel, Professor Yuri Clement, and Professor Gerard Hutchinson. Following In 1963, 1 year after independence, the government passed a narcotics bill which prohibited marijuana and set the stage for our legal modern framework of marijuana. In 2018, however, we had a CARICOM report on cannabis. And this report found that biases and inequalities are discernible in every aspect of the administration of the criminal justice system relating to marijuana, particularly with regards to the poor, the marginalized, and Rastafarians. Stereotyping and prejudices remain even in our courts. Because of how Caribbean societies are stratified, such inequity often translates into underlying race biases. Studies demonstrate that drug use itself is often a function of poverty and the lack of opportunities as a coping mechanism, so that the legal system penalizes and criminalizes the already vulnerable. And this was also in the context of a wide-ranging public consultation, which led in 2019 to the government decriminalizing low-level possession, while at the same time actually increasing the sanctions for other aspects. The Caribbean has one of the highest rates of cannabis use in Latin America. And given this, there are certain questions that remain. What are the properties of marijuana? What are the different varieties and types that are available? What are some of the potential benefits of it in terms of medical use and recreational use? And also, what are some of the risks and challenges of it? Particularly in terms of our young people, we are aware that the young brain continues to develop into the 20s. And emerging research seems to suggest that marijuana use has an impact on this developing brain. So at this point, I would like to introduce the very first speaker, who is Dr. Joni Lee Pow. Dr. Lee Pow is a research psychologist with interest in psychosis and cannabis use, and she is the research coordinator of the Trinidad site of a research program into marijuana. She is also an instructor in psychology in the Department of Behavioral Sciences, Yuri, St. Augustine. She has received an early career award from the Schizophrenia International Research Society and a fellowship from the Louisiana State University, where she completed her PhD. So Dr. Lee Pow will present some empirical evidence in terms of marijuana use, and so I invite you, Dr. Lee Pow.
Wonderful. A pleasant afternoon to all. Welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much, Dr. Asnod, for organizing this. It's lovely to all have you here. So, my name is Joni Lee Pow, as you heard. I'm an instructor in psychology in the Department of Behavioral Sciences, and I will be talking to you about some aspects of cannabis in Trinidad. So first of all, with regard to legislation, I'm not going to go too much into this. I'm going to leave this to our expert, Mr. Persad. But just very briefly, this first act, the Cannabis Decriminalization Act, allows you to have in your possession up to 30 grams for plants or 5 grams of resin. The second Cannabis Control Act here talks about the establishment of the Trinidad and Tobago Cannabis Licensing Authority, and whose roles are, amongst many, to develop policy and measures for regulatory control, to grant or revoke licenses, and to take enforcement if there's non-compliance. Both of these acts talk about grams. They don't talk about THC potency. So what do I mean by potency? What do I mean by THC? Why is this important? Why does potency matter? So THC, or delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, is the main psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, and that's what makes you feel high. This is also what is associated with the occurrence and experience of psychotic symptoms. So by psychotic symptoms, Professor Hutchinson might tell us a little bit more about that later, but in a nutshell, it has to do with disassociating from reality, so maybe hearing or seeing things that aren't actually there, like hallucinations, and also believing things that aren't actually real, and this would be delusions. So back to what I was saying, THC is the component of cannabis that's associated with having psychotic symptoms. So in one large European study that was done by DeForti and colleagues in 2019, they looked at over 1,000 cases and controls across Europe. And one of the findings was that persons who were using cannabis, using low potency cannabis daily, and by low potency, the THC level was below 10%, had a threefold risk of a psychotic disorder, compared to persons who were using high-potency cannabis daily, and by high potency I mean the THC level was above 10%, and they had a six-fold increase of a psychotic disorder. So what this is kind of indicating is that as the THC level goes up, the risk for psychosis and psychotic disorders increases. We don't have official estimates locally of the potency of our cannabis, but unofficial estimates range from 19 to 26% THC. So this means that we may be operating in a high potency market here. In other places around the world, such as Colorado and California, we see that cannabis potency, the THC percentage can go over 90% in some products like wax and shatter. So 3 brief observations about the local occurrence of cannabis. So one, I made some calls to local cannabis vendors, which abound social media. So on Instagram, on Facebook, it's very easy to find cannabis vendors. And many of them revealed that they hadn't put in their application yet. They were in the process of putting it in. They had put it in and they were awaiting feedback. It was not approved yet. Nevertheless, they were all quite willing to sell to consumers, to sell to their customers. When I asked about potency, none of them were able to give me answers on the THC potency of their products. Again, they all spoke in grams and milligrams and not potency. These are some news reports from last year, 2023, kind of showing that there's increased reports of children and adolescents using cannabis. One of these is from Jamaica, and it talks about gummies. But we have this increase in edibles as well. So, this does raise kind of concerns about how these yummy-looking treats, like gummies and brownies, how does it appeal to children, and what are we doing to safeguard children as we move forward with edibles? Also, with crime, despite being able to grow your own plants now, we still have a trafficking network. Again, these are all news articles from last year, but it does show that cannabis is still being trafficked illegally with cocaine and ammunition. And as with any product, such as consuming coffee or even clothing, it's always a good idea to think about how that product is produced, where does it come from, how is it transported, who is it affecting, is it being done in an ethical way, and we as consumers of any product, are we contributing to crime rates in an existing crime rate situation? That's always a good thing to think about. So I'm going to share with you some findings from Intrepid. So what is Intrepid? So Intrepid stands for International Research Program on Psychosis in Diverse Settings. It's a research program that was done by King's College London, and it was done in 3 sites across the world, one in India, one in Nigeria, and one in Trinidad. It took place from 2018 to 2022. And it looked at, within each site and between sites, the rates of psychosis, some of the associated risk factors, the outcomes, the symptomatology, as well as other things. Part of Intrepid include a case control study, where in each site there were 200 cases and 200 matched controls. So what this means is that in Trinidad, we were able to look at around 200 persons who had psychosis and compare them to 200 people who did not have psychosis, who lived in the same neighborhood and were around the same age. And this is great because it allows you to kind of identify some of the risk factors associated with developing a psychotic disorder. Intrepid had a baseline interview and a 2-year follow-up interview. So what I'm going to talk about is some of these baseline cannabis findings. And these findings were published earlier last year. And what we found is that in Trinidad, we have a very high prevalence of daily cannabis use. So that same European study that I spoke about, they found in the general population about 12 to 13% of the population in London and Amsterdam use cannabis daily. In Intrepid, we saw that around 20% of our general population is using cannabis daily. So really quite high estimates. So using unconditional logistic regression, we were able to look at the exposure of cannabis and how this relates to the odds of developing a psychotic disorder. And here, we saw that persons who use cannabis once a week or more were almost twice as likely to develop a psychotic disorder. And persons with a high dependency score, and what do I mean by that? We used an instrument or a survey by the World Health Organization called the WHO Assist that allows you to calculate a substance risk score. And persons with a high score here were almost 5 times as likely to develop a psychotic disorder. What this shows here is a comparison across different sites around the world. So the blue line is the prevalence of daily cannabis use in controls, which we use as a proxy for cannabis use in the general population. And the gray line is the adjusted psychosis incidence. So the first 3 points here are from 3 sites in Europe from that study that I told you about. So that's London, Amsterdam, and Bologna. And the other 3 points at the end are from the Intrepid study, and they would be India, Nigeria, and Trinidad. So as you can see here, cannabis use is likely contributing to the very high rates of psychosis that we observed in Trinidad. We were not able to measure potency, but this may be a contributory factor, along with other factors such as our high crime, trauma, and child abuse. I'd like to bring your attention, too, to what we observed within Trinidad. So within Trinidad, again, this blue line is the prevalence of frequent cannabis in controls. And the black line is the adjusted psychosis incidence. So if you look at what is here within that red outline, we can see that in those subgroups where there was a higher prevalence of frequent cannabis use, such as with Trinidadian men and Afro-Trinidadians, you saw a higher incidence of psychosis. And where there was less cannabis use, such as Trinidadian women and Indo-Trinidadians, you saw a lower incidence of psychotic disorder. So all this to show that we're kind of seeing a pattern here where there's more cannabis use, there's an increased risk for psychosis. Another finding that we saw was that early age of first use, and that means first using cannabis at age 15 or below, is linked to adult frequent use. So almost half of our participants, cases and controls, who were early users went on to become adult frequent users. And of course, this carries some implications for children and adolescents when they first use. How is this linked to later patterns of use and any subsequent risk? So currently, we're looking at these baseline findings and examining some of the reasons that people first use cannabis and some of the reasons people continue to use cannabis. And we're seeing that people who begin to use cannabis in Trinidad because of friends may have a higher risk for psychosis. People who begin to use to feel better may progress on to heavier use. And of particular interest, persons with psychosis were more likely to report other reasons for continuing to use cannabis than persons who did not have psychosis. So some of these reasons people with psychosis were reporting to use cannabis were to help with sleep, to help with their appetite, for stress, or because they were addicted. All of this to say that the reason you use cannabis and the reason you might continue to use cannabis, it matters because it seems to be linked to later patterns of use and risk, and more research is needed here. Hopefully in the future, I can update you with some of these findings. So very briefly, I want to talk to you as well about Dr. Tessa Roberts and her postdoc fellowship. So Dr. Roberts, who's here with us today, she was the research coordinator for the Intrepid project in King's College, and she did her postdoc fellowship here doing qualitative interviews with 32 persons who had psychosis. One of her major findings was that a lot of these persons with psychosis expressed that marijuana was an issue for them. So these are some quotes from her work. Where you see people were saying things like, everyone is doing it, everyone has it, it's easy to buy yourself an episode, the area was a bad influence, they're shoving drugs to you, you can go right here and get weed, everyone plants now, everyone's going to have, all of this to kind of indicate that the ubiquity and accessibility of cannabis does make the recovery process difficult for persons who do experience mental health issues. And in the same way that we can be sensitive to someone who is a recovering alcoholic, perhaps we as a people can, maybe also have that kind of sensitivity to persons who may be trying to quit using cannabis or avoid cannabis, and think about the social pressures that they may be facing as they go through this process. In looking at local understandings and perceptions, as part of their final year project, some psychology undergraduate students did a Yuri student survey last year in February of 237 students. They found that almost half of the students use cannabis, roughly half of the students use cannabis in their lifetime. 14% were using cannabis once a week or more, and about 10% first use at age 15 or below. So as part of this survey, the students were given a series of statements regarding cannabis and asked about their attitudes towards this or their perceptions. So they were given these statements and asked to either strongly disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. And what we found was that roughly half of students agreed and strongly agreed to statements such as marijuana improves your mood and mental health, using marijuana can help you focus and improve your concentration, weed is safer than alcohol, and the type of marijuana is a good indicator of its potency. Roughly a quarter of the students that we surveyed agreed and strongly agreed to statements such as marijuana is safe because it's natural. Marijuana is safer than other substances because you can't overdose. Marijuana has been decriminalized, making it safer for me to use. And it is only the substances that they add to weed that make it safe. Unsafe, sorry, that's what I meant to say, unsafe. Right. We saw that higher risk perception among these students was associated with less frequent use. And all I'm saying here is the students who had a more cautious attitude used cannabis less frequently. In terms of local understanding and perceptions, in the medical community, these are two posters from the National Health Research Conference last year in November. And one of them covers a survey of 149 Year 4 and Year 5 medical students, and they found that those students displayed below average knowledge of medical cannabis. Another one was of 249 pharmacists, where they found that they lacked substantial or high knowledge about medical marijuana, despite having a positive attitude towards its efficacy. So one, this is kind of indicating that the groups where we expect the highest knowledge and understanding of cannabis, such as university students in the medical community, there's work to be done in terms of education and awareness. And this also raises questions about what is the understanding and knowledge in the general population, and especially amongst our secondary school students. If this is what university students and medical community, what's going on with our secondary school students? What do they know and understand about this? So to conclude, we're seeing vendors selling cannabis who don't have approved licenses or who haven't even put in their application yet, not able to provide information to customers on the potency and the THC content of their products. We're seeing a possible increase availability and appeal to children with edibles. And what are the consequences with that? Possible effects on crime, in thinking about now that there are ethical ways in which to use cannabis, what is everyone's individual role and responsibility in possibly supporting any kind of illegal activity that is associated with the trafficking of cannabis. Thinking about the effects of psychosis and mental health, so the association between psychotic disorders and cannabis has been well documented and established internationally. There's, of course, not this work, but a whole body of work on this. Now we see it here locally, and as I mentioned, even within Trinidad, those subgroups that use more cannabis, you're seeing higher rates of psychosis. A possible inadequate knowledge and understanding of cannabis locally, as we see with university students and medical communities, suggesting a need for more education and awareness. There's no ability for young people to make an informed choice about consumption. And when I say that, I mean in the way that we can use alcohol. We don't use alcohol and just think about it in terms of 8 ounces. I wouldn't drink 8 ounces of alcohol And if it's bare versus if it's puncheon, I'm going to have a very different experience. Now, thankfully, I'm able to make a choice on that because I can look at the back of a bottle of the alcohol that I purchased in a grocery, and I can see how much alcohol is it, and if I want to just get a buzz, or if I want to drink 8 ounces of puncheon and die, right? So I'm able to know that. And we don't have that same sort of kind of informed ability to make a choice. So when people use a certain amount of grams or milligrams of cannabis, whether it's via smoking or whether it's via edibles or however it's being consumed, the question is, do young people know if what they're using is the bare equivalent of cannabis or is it the puncheon equivalent of cannabis? And that matters, right? And then lastly, there's no cap on THC potency as we move towards cannabis tourism. So as I mentioned, there are other places where THC potency goes above 90%, and perhaps as citizens may know, and we want to think about, is this something that we want in Trinidad? Do we want this on our market? How do we feel about that? So thank you all for listening very much. And to any young people who are listening, especially any Yuri students, if you ever see me on campus, always feel free to come up and talk to me more about this. I really do believe that education is not just about grades and passing courses, but it's about helping you to make choices to lead a good life and make good choices. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee Pow. It was very interesting for me to hear some of the more recent research into the connection between marijuana use and psychosis. One of the implications of marijuana being illegal for the vast majority of the time that we have been independent is that there has been a lot of fear-based models relating to marijuana. So persons will say no to drugs, don't smoke. But I don't think that all of that addresses the complexities of marijuana use and the fact that young people will experiment. And that reality cannot just be addressed by a fear-based model that doesn't really give people, including young people, enough information. So what happens when a person smokes? What happens in the human brains in terms of the neurons and the synapses? And that is not the type of information that I was given when I was in school. So we need educational context, formal and informal, in which people are informed, and there is lively and diverse discussions from different perspectives about all of the angles of cannabis use, and actually what happens to the human brain, and also what are some of the risk factors, and if persons choose to smoke or consume marijuana, having been given the information, what are some of the ways that people could do it safer to ensure that they do not reach a place where they are harmed by it? The next person I want to introduce will be dealing with marijuana use from a legal perspective. He is Mr. Rajiv Persad, Senior Counsel, and he is the head of the alum chambers based in Trinidad and Tobago, where he specializes in criminal law, public law, judicial review, and human rights litigation. This aspect of the conversation is important, given that it is only recently that the laws relating to marijuana use has been eased up. And I don't think that we have really recovered and repaired the damage from all of the many persons who have had their lives turned upside down from simple possession of marijuana. So I now introduce Mr. Rajiv Persad, Senior Counsel.
Thank you, Dr. Salandy. Good afternoon, everyone, members of the panel. Yes, I have 15 minutes to try to get some ideas out, which I'm hoping will be a basis for us to have a really in-depth discussion when we come to the question and answer session. I think my starting position is that many persons, regardless of age, do not hold a realistic sense of the laws on possession in relation to dangerous drugs generally and cannabis or marijuana, as we call it, specifically in Trinidad and Tobago. It is actually, I found it a little disturbing, some of the findings that Dr. Lee Pow was basically revealing in terms of how young people thought, some of the answers they gave strongly agree, strongly supported. And one of the first observations I think that's worthy of consideration is there really is no distinction in our laws that focuses on youth or age, okay? Our criminal justice system basically works on the basis of how much of the prohibited substance you are found in possession with. Everybody talks about the amendment to the Dangerous Drugs Act in 2019, and as a segue to say the easing up, not so sure about that, right? The Dangerous Drugs Act really was passed in 1991, and it had a very checkered history. Now, I'm not going to bore you all with the details of provisions, etc., but what I'm going to just try to do is explain a broad concept. If you were found with 50 grams of cannabis, marijuana, you were deemed to be in possession of that drug. There was no zero tolerance. You couldn't be found with it, full stop. That is, of course, to be compared to the 2019 amendment that says, hey, if you have 30 grams in your possession, that's okay, right? But that comes with a sting in the tail. The 50 grams that predated the 2019 Act basically meant be charged. And I will tell you, the criminal justice system was overburdened by police officers going out and picking up all sorts of people on the road, right, and bringing them before the courts. And so what you would do, you would have a drug court in Port of Spain, a drug court in Tunapuna, all over the place. And what you would find is really usually poor persons, usually people who just using the drug to take a ease up, etc., would find themselves before the court. Now, fortunately, the judicial officers' approach to it would be, well, look, if you're a first-time offender, we'll give you a bond, we'll give you a warning. You might, then you come with a second and third time, and you might get a fine, etc. But I think the courts were generally reluctant to jail you at that level. But it didn't, it's not to say it didn't happen. And of course, the problem with cannabis and other drugs is that you find yourself addicted. And therefore you yourself not really in control. And if the police, I always tell clients, if they hold you one time, they go be looking for you. It's as simple as that. So it's low-hanging fruit for the police to arrest you. So that was the regime for possession of cannabis, okay? But it got, much more severe. I describe our drug laws as draconian, okay? That's how I describe them, and I'll give you an example. If I ask people, tell me a place with draconian drug laws, everybody calls Singapore. Everybody is ball, get hanged or executed for that. But while I accept, we don't have that here. There came a time in the I think it was 2001, where they passed amendments to the 1991 legislation, and they introduced mandatory sentences in relation to trafficking of drugs. And I remember how it worked was this. If you were caught with, I'm going to say, not sufficient for possession, but if there's a kind of spectrum. You have those, persons I call who really addicted, who might be found in possession. Then you'd find those people who try to get drugs to make a little money to export and get caught in the airports, etc. They usually have a small. And then you have those ranging with, you find it in the ship, you find it in the car, you find bail. A choice to say, I want to go before a magistrate or get a summary trial. Quantum determined where you ended up. But if you had the misfortune to end up in the high court because of the quantum of drugs, you were looking at a mandatory sentence of 25 years, okay? They did make an allowance for young people, but there was much of allowance, okay? In the sense that if it didn't matter if you were a first-time offender, literally everybody came under that regime. And it got worse. Not only did you get a mandatory 25 years, but you also had a fine. The fine was $100,000. If you had $100,000 in the first place, you wouldn't be dealing with drugs. And if you couldn't pay the 100,000, 15 more years for non-payment. Now, I mean, think about it, 25 years before you had to pay the fine, you're probably in jail lockup. So it turned out to be a mandatory sentence of 40 years. And that was for basically everybody getting convicted of trafficking. Fortunately, a team of lawyers challenged the constitutionality of that provision, and in a case called Barry Francis, the Court of Appeal with 5 or 6 judges struck down that mandatory sentence as being unconstitutional. Now, I say that to put things in context. We are coming from a draconian background of how we deal with drugs. Maybe, you know, and it doesn't matter which government, it doesn't matter. It's a philosophy of how you treat with drugs, okay? And I think one of the points that I want to make in terms of trying to encourage discussion is that today, yes, we have a more enlightened approach, and that enlightened approach is probably best typified by the fact that now you can lawfully possess 30 grams, okay? And you're allowed 4 cannabis trees. Well, you know, all of us will be familiar with police take a raid in somebody's house and they find 3 plants or 4 plants and they take down families and everything, and or they hold 100 trees in some plantation or something like that. The simple point is this: yes, there is, it appears, this enlightened approach where a person can smoke 30 grams of cannabis and have 4 plants. And many will argue and many will agree that that's a move in the right direction, okay? The approach of the courts over the last decade has been a realization that, look, sending people to jail is not the answer for persons who are addicted, and we introduce the drug treatment courts so that persons who are willing to subject themselves to it would be allowed to get treatment, etc., and the court process would be a little more helpful, a little more understanding, a little more compassionate. And then there's been opening up of dedicated drug courts. But, you know, any realistic assessment has to look at that amendment in 2019. And we praise and we thank that there's that level of decriminalization. We appear to be in modifying our approach to decriminalization of possession of small amounts of cannabis. There remains aspects of our drug laws in relation to cannabis that have a bearing on young people who interact and deal with cannabis. I'm going to give a few examples and we can talk about it after. Section 21 of the Dangerous Drugs Act. You all wouldn't know it, but you would be familiar with the concept. If you are found in a vehicle, a house, a building, a plane, a warehouse, and you are in control of that premises and drugs are found, you are deemed to be in possession. The onus is on you to show that I didn't know the drugs were there and I didn't consent. Well, you know what that creates? That creates a problem when somebody in the household bring in the drugs, they hide it in the bedroom, police get word, or somehow the police find out, they come onto the premises, the warehouse, the building, anything, container, everybody going down. Well, I mean, I remember in the early days of me going into courts, magistrate court, and seeing a grandmother, grandfather, father, you know, mother with baby and all that kind of thing in the court system, because the police decided they don't do any investigation, they just take everybody down. The only people you said get away was the children under 18, right? Funny sense, the police are just doing because they are saying, well, look, we don't know who had control over this particular drug. We don't know who it belonged to. If you were found with the drugs on you, that's what we call personal possession. But what we have is this concept of constructive possession. And so it related to cars, it related to houses. I'm using that as the most common examples. I mean, we all know people who was taking a drop with somebody, or you offer a drop, because I always remember generationally, many years ago, my father and mother would stop to pick up. They see a nurse on the road, or they would pick up to give a drop, because that's what we did. Now, nobody's stopping for nobody, because they don't know. Next thing, they have a little weed or something, and they're taking everybody down. And the problem is, in a criminal justice system, which takes 10 to 15 years to figure out, it's a serious issue. It's a serious issue. Possession of marijuana in and around schools. Now, a lot of people just do not understand that even if you want to take a joint or whatever and put it in your pocket or put it in your school bag, and I'm talking not school bag but university you carry it, if you are found with that, you are deemed by the law to be in possession for the purpose of trafficking. I want you to understand that. So, and the definition of school, in subsection 7, school premises means the premises of a school, college, university, or other educational institution, and includes buildings, playing fields, other premises established, maintained, or used by such institution for the benefit of students, whether or not such buildings. Anyway, lawyers drafting. But the simple point is that, young people need to be aware that even though there may be 30 grams which they can avail themselves to, technically, there's, as I say, so many other things wrapped around that creates a problem. You certainly can't take it with you to school because nobody wants to hear about possession. You are deemed to be trafficking, and the onus is on you to show that it was for personal use. But by the time you do that 15 years later in the court system, you pay legal fees, you pay all sorts of fees. Really, was that smoke worth it? And it's things to think about, right? I wanted to also raise the point that as much as the amendment in 2019 decriminalized 30 grams, it snuck some very interesting pieces of or provisions into our law that didn't exist. Section 5, listen to this. Whilst under the influence of cannabis, any person who, whilst under the influence of cannabis, does anything which constitutes negligence, professional malpractice, or professional conduct. Now, I'm putting this in the context of young people, aspiring professionals, persons who are trying to build, move on with their life, etc. So that's one category. Or B, has cannabis on a school bus or in any premises where children are, commits an offense and is liable on summary conviction, to a fine of $250,000 and to imprisonment for 5 years. 2019, these are the laws coming in, being snuck in. The last point that I wish to make is I really would like to underscore from my experience in the courts over 25, 26 years, what I am seeing seeping into the criminal justice system. I'm going to give the example of 2 cases. Chap called Steve Mitchell, he's passed on now, was charged for murder and shooting with intent, etc. Somewhere, I think I can't remember the area, had smoked black cigarettes. I think we come back to potency, and we talk about that. I think Professor Eastman was actually brought in, not Professor Eastman, Professor Hutchinson was brought into the police station. I don't know if you remember that, years ago. He was found walking down the street naked as he was born. And it was a combination of mental health and drugs, right? And unfortunately, the young man died in prison. He never got a trial. But, you know, I recently did a resentencing hearing for another gentleman who killed 5 of his children, right? Killed 5 of his children. And I only got involved at the appeal stage after he had been convicted. And there was a piece of evidence that he was snorting cocaine on the dining table. And then, I mean, you know, look, however you are human, somebody doesn't go and kill their 5 children unless there's something that operated on their mind, etc. So he was recently, we did a resentencing, and, you know, he is sentenced to 35 years. And he still has time to serve out. But what it's showing to me, and that isn't murder, okay? I am seeing it in causing death by dangerous driving. There are cases where you see under the influence, persons committing offenses, then getting charged, having to go through. And, you know, I have seen numerous sexual offenses where either from the point of view of the defendant or other perspectives, it's coming out that there was drugs involved and people can't remember and this, that. So I'm closing by just simply suggesting to you all that it is certainly showing up in the criminal justice system, and we need to weigh that up. And I look forward to questions when we get around to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Persad, for sharing your expertise. And you shared some interesting information that many persons may not be aware of in terms of aspects of the law as it relates to cannabis use and possession. Personally, I quite agree that the cannabis laws have been draconian, and I'm not convinced that the changes made in 2019 have really dealt with the issues from the most progressive point of view. I think that we in the Caribbean have really lost an important opportunity, because since the 70s at least, Rastafarians in the Caribbean have been advocating for changes in the laws as it relates to marijuana. So it is quite sad for me that we in the Caribbean could only make changes to these laws when countries in the Western world have decided to make these laws and we simply mimic it and do accordingly. Since the 1990s, the Barry Chauvin-led commission in Jamaica made recommendations for changes in relation to marijuana, and this commission was ignored. So we have really lost an opportunity to develop a progressive framework for marijuana use and, in fact, a cannabis industry, and a more progressive framework to deal with the issues of addiction and to share deeper information about marijuana use so that it could be better understood. And I think that this very draconian, fear-based model has not really worked well in our favor. The next speaker I want to introduce is Professor Yuri Clement, and he is a professor of pharmacology and the coordinator of the pharmacology unit in the Faculty of Medical Sciences at UWI St. Augustine. And he has specialized research interests in cardiovascular pharmacology and the use of herbal medicine for therapeutic disease management. Professor Clement has led local research on the medical use of cannabis amongst cancer and glaucoma patients in Trinidad. So I welcome Professor Yuri Clement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salandy. I have 15 minutes, and I have to use my laptop here to get my PowerPoint. I wasn't used to using PowerPoints. So please excuse me. Okay, so I want to put a little spanner in the wheel today. Most people on the panel will be talking about the bad things about cannabis, but I want to throw a little bit of a... No, there are no comments. Okay, thank you very much. So I think that took up 5 minutes of my time. So, Chair, I need my 5 minutes back. Thank you. So we are going to talk a bit about cannabis today, and I'm a pharmacologist, and we are talking about drugs that are legal to use. Everybody on the panel will be talking about the bad effects of cannabis. So my team really is do not throw the baby out with the bath water. And that's where I'm going to jump out from. Because I think sometimes we talk about cannabis and we only see the bad things about cannabis. And this term was coined, I think, in Germany about 200 years ago, and it basically is telling us that we could lose something that's of value when we try to get rid of something that we do not want. In the world now, we have many countries that have legalized marijuana. Some places have given access to cannabis. So, for example, in Canada, it was legalized a few years ago, and people are saying it's a big public health experiment. Let us see what happens 10 years from now. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have tried to follow suit in a way. So in 2019, there was a law that was passed that allowed access. So people now are able to carry 30 grams of cannabis or plant 4 plants in their house. So if you have a large family of 10 people, you could plant 40 plants. I always tell people that that's a little field that you have of cannabis, and of course it will be legal. And of course, Mr. Persad spoke about the law in terms of possession, simple possession, trafficking, which is still very harsh. But in 2022, another law was passed in terms of how do you cultivate cannabis, how do you transport cannabis, how do you do research in cannabis, and all of the different aspects in terms of managing cannabis cultivation and sale. So they have found that this UN report in, I believe, 2022, it have found because cannabis is now so accessible, you have increased daily use of cannabis. And of course, there are more potent cannabis products. Normally it's about 3 to 5%. Now we have products with up to 25%. And because it's now accessible to people, you now have, Prof. Hutchinson will tell you, more people having psychotic disorders, psychiatric disorders. This graph here shows what's going to happen in terms of sales for legal cannabis over the next few years. So if you look at it, between 2020 and 2025, the sale of legal cannabis and cannabis-based products will be almost triple. If you look at in the graph, the middle portion, the blue portion, that portion talks about the recreational sale. And you can see as you go from 2020 to 2025, that sale is just increasing exponentially. As opposed to medicinal cannabis, which is at the bottom, you see it almost remain the same, and CBD increasing. So the allowing people more access is not allowing them to use it for medicine, but allowing them to use it for recreation. And that's the problem. Because just last year, Denmark has a registry of over 7 million people between 16 and 49, and they have had this registry for the last 50 years or so, and they were able to find 45 people who had incident schizophrenia, meaning that they had at least one episode of schizophrenia. And they have found a high risk of people who have schizophrenia and is linked to what they call cannabis use disorder. And that disorder has to do with the fact that people are on cannabis sometimes every day, high doses, and sometimes when they try to get off of it, they have difficulty getting off, they have withdrawal symptoms, and it doesn't really matter what happens with their social life or family life or work life. They just have this disorder where they need to use cannabis. And they have shown that it's higher in males, and especially younger males between 16 and 20, they have a risk of 25% risk of developing schizophrenia when they have this disorder. And of course, I believe Mr. Persad spoke about the laws that we have in terms of trafficking cannabis. And of course, last year was a bumper year for people being held with cannabis. I think one of the biggest hauls was $105 million of high-grade cannabis sometime in September last year. And of course, as Mr. Persad would have said, the consequences of this is that you end up in the court for a very long time, and when you are sentenced, you have a very long jail term. But my pivot on this is that there is benefit to cannabis. Cannabis is still a Schedule 1 drug in the US. In Trinidad and Tobago, it's still Schedule 1, where we say that this drug has no medicinal benefits whatsoever. It has a very high potential to cause addiction, and therefore we should not even consider it for medicine. But I want to talk to you today about a lot of indication, not a lot, a few of them, where we have evidence, and evidence as a scientist, where we have trials for these conditions using controlled amounts over controlled periods to give us evidence for the use of these, of use of cannabis and cannabis-based products. So there are a whole long list of them. I'm not going to go into all of them. I'm just going to focus on the one that we have the most evidence for. So for example, for pain, for nausea and vomiting in people who have chemotherapy. And there are some chemotherapy drugs that cause a lot of nausea and vomiting. And even with the standard drugs, the standard nausea and vomiting does not go away. And therefore you might need additional help to prevent nausea and vomiting. Also for epilepsy, we will see that in some cases there are some children who have severe epilepsy that the normal medication doesn't work. They are resistant, they're refractory to those drugs, and also for spasticity, people with multiple sclerosis who have spasms, muscle stiffness. Those are cases where cannabis could be used. So I did a little survey on PubMed, which is a database for scientific research, and there are almost 600 published studies and over 180 systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And that really is the very top of your evidence, and therefore we can use this evidence to make a decision. There are a number of products available, and you probably know about some of them. I'm not sure whether they're available locally, but in Europe and in the US, there are a number of them that's available on the market. In the last few years, I think that 2018, the last one that was marketed was Epidiolex, which is used for severe forms of childhood epilepsy. We'll see that later on, some of the evidence that is provided for the use of Epidiolex. So evidence is not somebody come and tell you, I use this and it worked for me. My grandmother used this all the time and it works. That is not evidence, that is anecdotal. Because it might work for you, but it might not work for me. Or I don't know what dose they're using, I don't know what strain they're using, I don't know what potency they're using. And if I cannot say because somebody have a pain, or somebody can't sleep, or somebody can't eat, and they use 2 puffs or 2 spliffs, and it worked for them, it will work for me. That is not evidence. That is hearsay, and that is probably putting yourself in danger of getting psychosis or some disorder. So the evidence I'm talking about is what we call randomized placebo-controlled trials. And in this case, what we do is that you have people with a condition, you have them randomized, meaning that anybody could get anything, either the placebo or the intervention, and therefore you follow them for a period, and at the end of the period, you measure certain things. So for example, if somebody has epilepsy, I will want to know from the beginning how many fits do they have, how many fits a month they have. I give them the drug over a period of a month or so, and I see at the end of it how many fits they have and whether it's less than what they started with. And that's the kind of evidence we are talking about, not evidence where people tell you, this is happening with me and I'm just going to take it as gospel. So besides having these clinical trials, the highest level really is what they call a meta-analysis, where we pool all these trials together for a particular condition, and we have we do a quantitative analysis, where we compare the effect between the placebo, and the placebo is something that looks like, tastes like, smells like, but is not. Yeah? So if I take a picture of myself and I put it next here, it looks like me, right? But it's not me, so that is the placebo. But in the case of an experiment, the patient doesn't know the difference between the real thing and the placebo. And therefore you kind of nullify it, or you kind of subtract the effect that they will have from the doctor interacting with the patient. At the end of it, you now do measurements for the 2 groups, the treated group and the placebo group, and see whether there's a difference between those 2. And there are a number of things that we will do to look to see whether there's a different measurements. So firstly, we look at cannabis and cannabinoids for the treatment of pain. And normally what they do, pain is very subjective, so they give you a piece of paper, it's a scale from 0 to 10, and they ask you, how is your pain? Is it no pain at all, moderate pain, or the worst pain ever, where I can't do anything. All I could do is focus on my pain. And they measure that, they give you that scale at the beginning, and tell me on this scale where your pain is. So your pain might be 8 or 9 or 10. And then at the end of the period, they were going to ask you, what is your pain? And then you have to tell them where on the scale your pain is. But at the same time, you don't know whether you're given the active treatment or whether you're given a placebo. And then they will measure that over time. So in this review, they had 6 trials with almost 2,700 people with pain, and they were treated for between 6 and 12 months, and they saw that pain decreased by about 1.75 on that scale. And therefore, they say that there's a moderate decrease in pain. On the downside, you have a lot of people having side effects, central nervous effects, dizziness, drowsy, abdominal side effects. And because some of these effects were so severe, some people dropped out. In this other study, with people who had cancer pain, which is a bit different than non-cancer pain. And in this study, they had 5 trials with about 1,500 patients. And they saw, if you look at this graph at the top here, is what we call a forest plot, where they compare differences between first individual studies. They pool all these studies, and then they find a pool different. And if you see the last at the bottom there, you will see a little shape, the black shape at the bottom there, and you see that it's very close to 0. And 0 means that there's no difference between the placebo and the treatment. And what they have found in these 4 studies is that the cannabis and cannabinoids, they have no effect to reduce pain. And in these patients, they were all using opioids, and it did not cause them to reduce their use of opioids. And a negative is that the use of these drugs, cannabis and cannabinoids, it causing CNS effects, drowsiness, and dizziness. This larger study, it was published in the British Medical Journal in 2001, and you have 32 studies with over 5,000 people. And they had both chronic pain, non-cancer, and cancer pain. And they have found that it's just a marginal decrease in pain, in the pain score, which is about 0.5 on that scale of 0 to 10. But at the same time, you have a lot of the risk of the CNS, the drowsiness, the impairment of thinking and ability to do things. So therefore, you want to think, why am I putting people at risk for just a small or marginal decrease in pain? Because 0.5 means if I am the worst pain, it's just a little less than that, right? And would I risk myself using cannabis for a very marginal decrease in pain and exposing myself to all of the adverse effects of cannabis? We now come to the use of these agents for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. And the Cochrane Library, there's a group of scientists who do these reviews, and normally Cochrane really is the gold standard in these reviews. And they have shown that people who are using drugs for cancer and have severe nausea and vomiting, that there was no difference between the standard drug for nausea and vomiting as compared to these agents. However, they have found that compared to placebo, there was a significant difference for the reduction in nausea and vomiting. And of course, you have all the side effects. You have dizziness, euphoria, dysphoria, which is the opposite of euphoria, feeling high, and sedation. And there are 2 small studies that were done with chemotherapy, for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. In both of them, they were also given drugs for nausea and vomiting, and in both of them, they found that there was a significant reduction in the incidence of nausea and vomiting in those patients. So, of course, there's a good, and in addition to the good, you have the incidence of side effects: dizziness, sedation, drowsiness. I'm trying to go a little fast. I'm not seeing my time being up as yet. So we continue with multiple sclerosis, where you have damage to the nervous system that cause some defects. And a big defect in multiple sclerosis is when you have muscle stiffness. And of course, there's a way to measure muscle stiffness. There's a scale that they use to measure it. So in these studies, they would have given the intervention over time and measure whether there's a decrease in the muscle stiffness and spasms for these people. Again, we have the Cochrane database and the Cochrane meta-analysis. They looked at almost 2,300 patients with a variety of these products, and the study lasted for up to 12 weeks, up to almost a year. And they have found that now Bixolol, which is an extract of cannabis, is 2.5 times more likely to reduce spasticity or muscle stiffness in people with multiple sclerosis. And of course, we have a lot of side effects. In treating epilepsy, you have another study, meta-analysis, with people who are drug-resistant to anti-epileptic agents, people in randomized studies and people with observational studies. And they have found that given 2 milligrams per kilogram per day CBD, that it was beneficial in people who were also given the conventional treatment. And it reduced the frequency and also the severity of the episodes. And we're coming on to the end. So this study here is a relatively large study with drug-resistant Dravet syndrome, which is a condition in young children from the age of, it started very early, from about 1 to 3 years old. And they have a severe form of epilepsy. And sometimes the epilepsy does not respond to the standard treatment. And they give this CBD and compare it with placebo over 14 weeks. And at the beginning, they were able to measure different things. So for example, they were able to measure the number of seizures for the month before they start the treatment. And then they had the treatment for 14 weeks, and at the end of that, they were able to measure whether there was a reduction in the number of seizures. So in this table, you see that we have 2 categories, the placebo and the CBD. And for the baseline, you had 12 episodes within the last month, and for placebo, you had about 14. So there was no big difference between the number of seizures in the last month. At the end of the 14-week period, you see that the incidence of seizures dropped by almost half in the CBD group, whereas there was no change really in the placebo group. So there's a big drop, there's a big change in the number of seizures these children had. And we could understand you having a child, 2 years, 3 years, and every other day there's a seizure. The seizure doesn't go away completely, but at least you have less seizures and less anxieties associated with the condition. And of course, you also have all of the side effects for this. In this last case with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is very rare, but there are people who suffer it, and of course, they have many seizures, some of them many seizures in one day. This study used a low dose, a high dose, and a placebo. They measure the frequency of what they call drop seizures, and a drop seizure is when you lose total control and you just fall. And they were able to measure the number of drop seizures at the baseline and also the number of drop seizures during the course of treatment. In this slide here, you will see what's happening at different times. And what they have shown at both doses, low dose and high dose, there's a significant drop or a significant fall in the number of drop seizures in these patients. So in conclusion, there are a number of what we call indications for the use of cannabis and cannabis-based medicines. There are many adverse effects, but sometimes you have to balance it off, because as a pharmacologist, I know that there are drugs that have many side effects, and sometimes you balance the benefit with the risk. For example, there are drugs for heart problems, irregular heartbeat, that have many side effects. But of course, you would prefer the person to have the side effect as opposed to having to die suddenly. And if you put that in a balance, and sometimes for cannabis, maybe that is the risk that we take, having side effects, but at least, for example, in the very severe cases of epilepsy, reducing the number of incidents. And of course, we need to explore other chemicals in the plant. We focus so much on THC and CBD, but there are over 100 other chemicals that are also available that we could also do some studies on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Clement, for sharing your expertise with us. The Rastafarians have long advocated and asserted that marijuana is for the healing of the nation, and you have presented some information that explores some of the medical benefits of marijuana use. I also know that both yourself and Dr. Anthony Pottinger has been leading local experts and pioneers in terms of contributing towards public understanding of some of the medical benefits of medical marijuana. And I think that the fact that marijuana has been illegal for so long has really been a stumbling block for us to explore some of the medical benefits of it. And you have some experts actually estimating that the current cannabis industry is poised to be a $500 billion industry. And I think that we in the Caribbean here should have been further along in terms of exploring some of the benefits of medical marijuana. Our next speaker is Professor Gerard Hutchinson, and he is a lecturer and unit lead at the Psychiatric unit of Yuri, St. Augustine. And I welcome him to share his expertise on this very important topic.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Salandy, and the other panelists. And of course, you, the audience. I want to thank Dr. Lee Pow for arranging the panel discussion. Cannabis is, of course, a very fascinating subject and also very controversial in many ways. I think that I want to begin by saying two things. One is that when we talk about cannabis, we refer to it as a kind of homogeneous substance, but I think we have to acknowledge that it isn't really homogeneous in the sense that all cannabis is the same cannabis. As both Dr. Lee Pow and Professor Clement said, cannabis is composed of a set of compounds called cannabinoids, and these cannabinoids have different effects. There are several hundred of them. The two major ones that have been understood and researched are THC and CBD. And if you think about that as a spectrum, THC is the psychoactive cannabinoid, and CBD is the least psychoactive, but also the most medicinal. So when we talk about it, we have to recognize that the presence of CBD and THC and the relative amounts of the two determine the effect that the use of cannabis has. And in that way, cannabis is different to alcohol in the sense that the active ingredient in alcohol is, well, commercial alcohol that is consumed is the same. It's just a question of concentrations. But in this instance, the presence and, of course, the way they interact with each other also contributes to the effect. So in essence, THC is the cannabinoid that makes you high and is associated with recreational use, and CBD is the cannabinoid that is associated with medicinal use. Of course, that's relatively simplistic because CBD can cause some amount of psychoactivity as well, and THC also does have some medicinal value. So I think that's an important thing to understand and appreciate as we look at it. The other thing, which is to me more fascinating, is that the body produces cannabinoids. The human body produces cannabinoids. And we have a range of cannabinoid receptors in our bodies, particularly proliferating in the brain and the gut. And what that tells us is that human beings have interacted with cannabis for a long time. So evolutionarily, the body has developed these receptors. And in addition to that, the body produces what are called endocannabinoids. So the body itself makes these little molecules called endocannabinoids. And when you use cannabis, the plant, so the cannabis from the plants are called phytocannabinoids, phyto, the prefix meaning plant-based. They engage with these cannabinoid receptors. So in trying to understand the effects of cannabis, of course, they've looked at how and why do we have these endocannabinoids. And again, science hasn't really confirmed exactly why, but it's known that they're implicated in a variety of things: learning and memory, the immune response, pain, the appreciation of sensory stimuli, the gastrointestinal system and how your gut responds to certain nutritional substances. So it means that these endocannabinoids are quite important. And again, the presence of those receptors and the way those receptors are oriented in each individual determines how they respond to external cannabis or plant-based cannabis. So in saying that, I think it's another important thing to bear in mind that our brains are the thing that make us who we are. And therefore, as with everything else that affects our brains, one size doesn't fit all. And I think we have to recognize that, again, in different people, any substance will affect them differently. So having said that, being a psychiatrist, most of the information that is related to cannabis use is related to the problems that we see. And issues related to cannabis use began to be described first in Jamaica in the early 1970s. Two psychiatrists there, Frank Knight, who was a Trinidadian working there, and an American psychiatrist, Timothy Harding, they published two papers in 1973 and 1976, respectively. Harding's paper was titled Marijuana Modified Mania, and Knight his was entitled Ganja Psychosis. And in those papers, they described the phenomenon of particularly young people presenting to the psychiatric services with these psychotic symptoms. So psychotic symptoms are symptoms, as Dr. Lee Pow mentioned, where people are not engaged fully with reality. So they have perceptual abnormalities, they hear things, they see things, as well as beliefs that are inconsistent with their background and people who they associate with. And this was associated, even then, they identified this was associated with excessive use and perhaps the use of particular kinds of cannabis. Since then, the literature has been suffused with papers talking about the negative effects in those terms, and not only with psychosis, but excessive cannabis use has been associated with panic disorder, anxiety disorders, suicidal ideation, depression, and a range of other disorders. The association with learning and memory, as I mentioned, the endocannabinoids seem to be related to that. Also have shown that people who use excessive amounts of cannabis are also likely to have some short-term memory impairments. However, those impairments improve once they abstain. So it means that for some people, using excessive amounts of cannabis and perhaps cannabis that is high in THC content are much more likely to develop these psychiatric conditions and therefore are at risk in being exposed to this kind of cannabis. The other major factor that has been identified in that context is early age of exposure. Again, Dr. Lee Pow talked about that, and it's generally thought, based on the research literature that people who've started using cannabis before age 14 or less, again, are more likely to develop these conditions if they continue to use into their adult life. And of course, as Dr. Lee Pow said, there's also some evidence to suggest that when you start using earlier, you tend to use more as you grow older. So we have three factors: early age of use, use of high THC content, and excessive use as being the risk factors. So the question is the drug itself, or THC itself, a cause of these conditions, particularly psychosis? Again, because of its illegality, research into how that potency and that excessive use can cause these conditions has been really more epidemiological rather than biochemical. But there are basically three theories that have been proffered to assess this question. One is, of course, that the high THC content is associated with psychosis, and anybody who uses enough and uses cannabis of enough potency can develop a psychotic disorder, which is the causal hypothesis. Then there's also the reverse causal hypothesis, which speaks to people who are at risk for developing these disorders, these psychotic disorders, these anxiety disorders, these mood disorders, because of their inclination that has been developed because of that risk. They are more likely to use cannabis more frequently and seek more concentrated and stronger forms of cannabis than their peers who do not have that risk. And of course, the third hypothesis is that the two things are independent, and by chance association, you have this risk for these disorders, you happen to use cannabis, and because you use cannabis, these disorders are expressed. There are no final answers to that question yet, although most of the evidence seems to be pointing towards the reverse causal hypothesis, meaning that people who are predisposed to developing these disorders are more likely to use more. And that brings me back to the point about one size not fitting all, meaning that we have to acknowledge that all substances or any substance can have negative effects. I think Professor Clement made an interesting point about the baby and the bathwater, and I think all things have potential value, and we have to recognize that value while recognizing the risk. So the key element, therefore, I think, is for people to be aware, one, of their family history and their risk of developing psychiatric disorders, as well as of the risks of using cannabis, particularly cannabis with high amounts of THC. And I think this is one of the advantages, the potential advantages of the whole process of legalization and decriminalization, again, as Dr. Lee Pow said, because if we know the quantity or the percentage of THC that we're consuming, then we can have a better sense of what the risk might be. And of course, there's been a burgeoning market in medicinal marijuana, which, as I said, is predominantly CBD-based cannabis. And again, understanding how that works in the context of its relationship to THC and the other cannabinoids is also important. I think the final point I want to make is that we generally, I think, have to reorient our perception or perspective on substance use in general, because I think while we identified cannabis as an issue in this context, other drugs also cause lots of problems. And we have, I think, generally a kind of permissive use of substances in our society. And as Dr. Salandy mentioned earlier, because of a lack of information, a lack of education, I think people are not aware fully of all the risks and even of some of the potential benefits, and therefore they can't make informed decisions about drug use. And I think that's where our attention has to be focused, because people will use substances. It's something that that human beings seem almost inevitably inclined to do. So it is really about helping people understand that maybe there's some things I shouldn't use or I shouldn't try, or if I try it and I recognize that I react in a certain way to it, I shouldn't continue to use it. In that context, as Dr. Lee Pow mentioned, we see so many young people presenting to our services, and I think they have increased since the decriminalization, with cannabis-related problems, meaning that they develop these psychiatric problems or mental health problems in the context of excessive and excessive use representing a change in use, meaning that they were using a certain amount before and then started to increase their use, and then the problems presented themselves. So that subset of users definitely need particular support, and I think with the changes in terms of legalization and decriminalization, we have to focus on providing that kind of support. The other point I'll make in closing is that, generally speaking, substance use rehabilitation centers have not focused on cannabis in the past. They have focused on alcohol on one hand, and where we also have a significant problem in this society. Someone mentioned to me recently that we have allegedly or reportedly the highest number of Alcohol Anonymous groups per capita in the world. And on one hand, as I said, and cocaine and prescription-related drugs on the other. So I think we do need to develop services to help people manage difficulties with cannabis use, and we have to develop them in the context of this wave that I think will continue given the decriminalization and the trend towards legalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hutchinson, for sharing that very nuanced presentation on marijuana use. And I quite agree with you that human beings will seek various opportunities for that high. And we do have serious issues in the Caribbean around addiction. And I think that one of the experiments that happened in one of the Nordic countries that I think is very insightful is that recognizing that they had a drug problem with their young people, they made deliberate efforts to provide more opportunities for young people to access natural highs. So it wasn't just telling young people, don't take drugs or no marijuana, but there were opportunities for young people to get more active types of experiences. As detailed in the CARICOM Regional Commission on marijuana prohibition has had a lot of deep negative socioeconomic consequences for the entire Caribbean region. And the cost to enforce a range of anti-marijuana laws have cost taxpayers billions of dollars over the last few decades. And these resources could have been better used to understand the socioeconomic effects of marijuana, to address addiction, and to offer more opportunities for young people to be engaged other than seeking a high through artificial substances. The changes of the laws in 2019 have introduced new challenges and new situations, not only in the workplace, but also in the educational context. And I think that this panel today presented a diverse set of perspectives around marijuana use in the context of Trinidad and Tobago. At this point, I want to invite the virtual audience as well as the physical audience to engage various comments and or questions relating to what is presented, and I would encourage persons to be concise in terms of your question and comment, and the online audience can also post your questions, and I am told that they will be passed to me. So at this point, I will open the floor. Is there a roving mic? Persons should speak into the mic for the question. So if you just raise your hand, somebody will pass the mic to you. So I'll start with the gentleman on the left. So I'll take a round of 2 questions, and then we will get appropriate responses.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the panel. I've really enjoyed today a lot. I've really learned a lot, and I've been on a steep learning curve for, I'd say, about the last year. I knew nothing about any of this, really, a year ago. I would say that a year ago, I was one of the people that said, well, you know, having a spliff is about the same as having a beer. In fact, it's probably more healthy because it's not hurting your liver. So a joint's probably not such a bad thing. I definitely thought, let's legalize it. And I learned today how much more nuanced that is. So I was very interested to hear about that. But for me, I'm really, have met so many people in the last year. And I've lived in Trinidad a long time, but I have relatives in England and America. In Trinidad and in England and America, I have met multiple people with young people developing serious issues and psychosis and addiction to marijuana. So I've changed from someone who thought, it's not really a big deal, to someone who's really, really concerned about it. And I would say the big thing for me, I'm thinking that we've had the pandemic, and so there's a lot of anxiety in our young people. And I would put to the panel that I feel like we're on the edge of an epidemic of issues due to drug use, but particularly marijuana use and psychosis from marijuana use. And I'd also say that I would really like to see, and maybe it's just my own ignorance, but I would like to see more preparation for the families of people that are having these problems. So what is being done to put information out there so that both at-risk people will understand what they're getting themselves into, but also for the people that surround them, families, carers, etc., what they might be dealing with. Because a lot of people that I know have been flung into a situation that they knew nothing about. So I would love to know from the panel if you agree with it's an epidemic coming, and also what is being done to get information out there. And certainly this was an excellent start for me today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I saw a hand on this side. I'll go with the gentleman in the back, and then after I'll come to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Question to the panel. What would you say to employers about the continued use of pre-employment drug testing, particularly for cannabis in Trinidad and Tobago? And a second question, what about, or what would you consider to be the most potent points to bring across to youth when we consider what some people call the ethical ambiguities of cannabis use? Thank you.
So who wants to take the first response?
So I think the first question about the risk or the likelihood of a epidemic, I think is something that we have to consider. I think you made an interesting point about the pandemic and the aftermath of this challenge that the global community has had to cope with the risk of illness and death with a virus, plus the fairly stringent measures that were instituted to combat it. And of course, those stringent methods seem to have affected our young people most. Again, for a variety of reasons, the impact on school, the focus on online interaction, and again, I think the Dr. Salandy mentioned the thing about natural highs and alternatives to the use of drugs in general as a means of getting high. And I think the pandemic and its effects in many ways stymied that kind of approach, because I think people naturally tended to look inward, and because of the anxieties that were associated with it, the use of drugs across the board has become more prevalent. I think the evidence for that is pretty overwhelming. So bearing that in mind, and bearing also that the people who might have been at risk would also have been the risk of them developing their conditions because of those same issues coming out of the pandemic, I think means that the collision of the two, or the confluence of the two, would mean that the risks of a mental health epidemic, I think, are quite high. And again, one of the big outcomes of the pandemic has been the greater awareness and greater appreciation for mental health conditions and the way in which these conditions can present and affect people, both in terms of their own development, but also the development of their relationships and how they interact with their families. Again, I think going back to the point about preparation and information, the debate around cannabis, I think, has largely not been informed by this sense of appreciating why young people use it and what its all-round effects are. And I think that I agree that there needs to be a lot more work done with families to help them understand why their adolescents and their young adults who they live with are more likely to use cannabis, and to also appreciate the effects, appreciate the changes that they might observe, so that if those changes suggest that the use is becoming problematic, or the effects of use are problematic, that they understand how to seek help, when to seek help, where to seek help, and to manage it more effectively. I think that's also related to the idea of having services that can address this. And I think we are still quite deficient in that regard, in terms of developing services that are particularly focused on that population of people who have mental health problems and also have potential problems with cannabis use, but with drug use more generally.
And also there was a question from the gentleman on the right.
That's okay. So I just wanted to make one quick point. When you're talking about families and families having access to information about this, so I do realize is, a lot of times there's a bunch of nerds talking about this and sharing information in scientific journals, and it's not accessible to people when they actually need information. A website that I do really strongly recommend is something called Johnny's Ambassadors. It was created by Laura Stack, who is a mother in Colorado who lost her son to suicide after he had psychotic symptoms from cannabis. She, bless her heart, has made it her life's mission to take all of the scientific findings and the research and make it accessible and reader-friendly to the everyday man. So if you have questions about this, or you know a family member or people that have, psychotic symptoms related to cannabis, Johnny's Ambassadors is a wonderful website to look at.
I don't want to start by saying it's reached epidemic proportions. I think that is something that one draws a conclusion from research and pulling together material. Having been here today, having listened to the panelists, I think there certainly is a basis to worry. I certainly think that there is a need for further research and for more work to be done. And we may very well find that, we are getting there. Trinidad and Tobago, unfortunately, is a reactive society as opposed to a proactive society. And if on this issue we could probably get the material, look at it, and try to put things in place to try to mitigate and to do things, that would be great. The question in terms of asking where do we get information, etc. I started my presentation by saying one of the things I've noticed is that people, it doesn't matter if it's young people or others, nobody really appreciates the legislative framework. I think, we're the type of people where if we see in a newspaper headline, they decriminalize, we take that and we go with it, but we don't really go in and look a little deeper. And I do think there's a need, certainly in relation to the legislative framework in Trinidad and Tobago, for people to really look and see what is possible, what is not possible. And unfortunately, people don't like going and reading legislation. Give you a secret, neither do lawyers. But the point is, it's an occupational hazard. To answer the question that was asked in relation to employment and testing, very interesting question, because on one hand, it's legal to consume marijuana in your private premises, etc. But I guess the simple point is this: you can't take it to work. Not so much the substance, but you can't be high and go to work. Now, having said that, the amendment to the 2019 legislation expressly makes it a criminal offense to be under the influence of a drug and carrying out some function, etc., which I thought was very interesting because it's taken it out of the realm of employment discipline. So whereas if you're in the public service and you come, they could bring you up for some sort of discreditable conduct or something, they could find a charge under the public service rules or the police service rules, or even private in your employment contract. They could find a way to make the fact that you come to work high or you appear to be high as a basis. But it's a tight rope to walk because, in a sense, the effects of if you consume marijuana can last a while. And how do you deal with that? How are you going to tell an employer if an employee comes in visibly under the influence or in a position where you could tell that their work is being affected by the fact that they under some drug or something? How could you tell an employer that they have no right to say anything? But I don't know that the answer is testing. Testing, how's that going to work? I mean, so let's talk about people who pilots, etc., persons in positions like that. They're going to have to put in place zero tolerance policies, and they may say you might have to go through random drug testing, something perhaps like that. And if you're found with drugs in your system, I think the employer might be in a better position. I don't know if we could say that they have to go through mandatory day testing. I don't know what you were thinking, but so it's an interesting issue. Yes. Did you want to ask?
I would love to expand on that question.
I'll go through the chair. Yes? Yes. Sure. I'm told briefly because we have other persons, but sure, please, if you could.
In 2021,
yes,
the former head of the industrial court expressed a view about the employer's right to pre-employment drug testing. Mm-hmm. So my question really is, before I get on the books, before I become an employee, to what extent would you or what views would you express to the employer who maintains pre-employment drug testing as part of their selection and recruitment process? Is there still value in that? Yeah. So, or are we heading down an ethical road that can probably end us up in let's say, another place, right, industrial court and so
right,
forth?
So let me just briefly start with what should be a foundation position. Contracts of employment between employers and employees, it's a contract. So both parties, in theory, are supposed to agree. I suppose an employer could say, well, look, having regard to the nature of your job, you have to do pre-testing. Police might have to do polygraph testing, certain things. But it has to be where the employer makes it clear upfront that if you are coming into this job, this is a term of the employment. And of course, as an employee, if you agree to that, then it's fine. But the question that could arise is that whether or not such conditions are unreasonable. And I'm not going to express a view because law is about generalizations and exceptions. And what we learn is that, in some cases, it may be reasonable, in some cases, it may be unreasonable. That's something for the courts to figure out in the future. Hope that answers your question. Good.
Thank you very much. Just an addition to what was said before, in terms of the drug testing, I'm hearing that you don't want someone who will be employed, who will be paid from doing work. But we have to realize that cannabis is a strange creature in that you smoke it now, and 2 weeks from now, it could still be found in your blood or in your urine. And I would think that it might be unfair for someone who might be using cannabis occasionally to be caught in a trap where they might have used it a month ago and they found it and they're barred from getting a job. An example is, I don't know if you all remember the American sprinter, Hutchinson, she was on the verge of Olympics a few years ago, and she had a situation where her mother died, and she said that she had used cannabis to help deal with that situation. And there was a random blood test that was done. She may have taken the cannabis a few weeks ago, and it was found in her blood, and she was debarred from Olympics. We don't want situations to happen like that, where somebody may have used it. It is accessible. It's being permitted to use. The law is saying that you can have 30 grams of cannabis on you. You can use 30 grams of cannabis. You can grow 4 plants. But at the same time, they're saying that it should not be found in your blood, and that should debar you from employment. So just to put that caveat out, that sometimes it could be like a double-edged sword with people who, when the law is saying one thing, and you're being penalized for something else.
So I saw a hand over here, so I'll take you and then you.
Thank you to the panel. And my issue is that drugs on the whole, cannabis and all, have become a social issue. And growing old, people will not change really. But if we want to reach youth, we have to think about, as the educational part, how we going, has the social issue being addressed by social studies in school, where, because we have legislation to show we could use drugs, and how can we in this whole that we talk in, move this educational factor into the arenas, even if you think to parents, can the health centers be used to educate the parents who go to the health center? Are we using our facilities to make the social issue less problematic?
And in the meantime, we just have a question from the audience, the online audience, and someone asks, what recommendations would you all suggest to wean the youth population from their use of marijuana?
Pleasant good evening to all. So I have 3 points, 2 questions. One on the medicinal value of cannabis and the other on recreational use. So presently, how are we controlling marijuana consumption to treat with persons who are inappropriately self-medicating with cannabis and inaccurately diagnosing themselves and using cannabis. On the recreational use, I don't know if there's any, if you all have ever seen any cases with persons who would have not been able to satisfy their munchies, because I'm seeing a lot of people smoking, but I'm seeing a lot of people who are smoking, getting munchies, and they're not eating, and then the effect from that is low blood sugar, right? So how does that effect then deal with mental health issues and physiological issues? Going back to the first point, I know not only with cannabis, people self-medicate and self-diagnose themselves with a lot of stuff. I had a friend recently, she had migraines. She spent a couple of months taking Panadol until she passed away. Autopsy revealed that it was a stroke. So again, at the health center level, at that level, how are we going to, or do we have a multidisciplinary team working at health centers to treat with these issues? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So I would invite the panel to maybe nominate somebody to go first. Really, I run out of time, so I will ask the presenters to be concise.
So I'll try to be very concise. In the 2019, what was passed in Parliament, there is a provision in there for a physician to prescribe. And in that provision, the physician must also indicate the amount and how it's to be done. If they recommend, they have to have records of it. And I believe in the 2022 version of the updated law, there was a provision for, in terms of the pharmacist to be able to dispense. So all of it is recorded, but I'm not too sure in terms of the actual practicality of it, if it's being done at all now. Most people now are, as you say, self-prescribing. What I've shown here is more or less studies that were done in a very controlled manner. So you're given a certain dose over a certain time. People now are self-medicating. They're not sure, okay, if they're smoking, they don't know how many smokes is a dose, how often they must dose, how long must they dose. So right now it's more a bit of a chaotic situation where people are self-medicating, don't know what they're doing. The law is allowing people to have 30 grams on their possession, so it means that they don't even need to go to a doctor. They get it wherever they get it from, and they self-medicate. So it needs to be cleared up exactly what is the role of the doctor, what is the role of the physician in prescribing, because if you can get it on your own, why do I need to go to a doctor to get it?
So with regard to the question with, how to get young people to kind of wean off of this, and then, we talk about, a lot of this seems to be, talking about the pros of cannabis and the cons of cannabis. And really, what I feel most passionate about is young people advocating for their right to make informed choices. And this is not really a legality issue as much as an individual issue, and your right to make an informed choice about many things, whether it's the behavior you engage in, the substances you put in your body, the food you eat, the alcohol you drink, the cannabis you use. And really, it's not about taking away your right to do something, but it's really about you thinking about your own rights as a consumer and your right to know about the products that you consume and what's contained in them and the effects it's going to have on your body. And I hope that persons who are listening to this, that's something that you maybe feel a little bit more passionate about and a bit more engaged in.
So we are almost out of time. Well, we are out of time, but in the interest of getting a little bit more from the audience who I know have burning questions, I'll take 2 concise questions or contributions from the audience, starting with Mr. Ramkisoon, and then I'll go to you.
Do I really need a mic?
Yes, for the online audience.
Good afternoon, everyone. So just a few points, really quick, right? Yes, it's agreed and has been agreed by, for those who don't know me, I've been the consultant to a number of regional governments given the responsibility and task of writing, not drafting, writing the decriminalization amendments and the medical law and the hundreds of pages of regulations to follow it, right, in a number of countries in the region. I'm proud to say that my proposals are being used in different ways by different governments across the region. That being said, the advice that I give is not the advice that the government would take wholeheartedly. They make their own changes. For instance, allowing persons to manufacture their own medicine in this day and age, it's akin to me to, as a comment I heard from another political party recently, to give the society firearms to defend themselves. Why do we have a police service? Right? And in my mind, these types of issues they need to be looked at from a more holistic perspective because these can cause the dangers. No one disagrees that cannabis use, high THC use, frequency of use can potentially lead to various mental conditions. I think Professor Hutchinson, I don't know if you put it within a subset of your causal effect of the three things proffered, but one of the major aspects that's being discussed and has been discussed is a lot of persons are predisposed to certain mental illnesses, and then the use of cannabis, especially THC, can activate, like in schizophrenia, can activate those symptoms. That's been proven without a doubt. What does end up happening, as he said, within the reverse hypothesis, is a lot of people who develop mental issues then choose to use cannabis for relief, and in some cases that worsens their symptoms. All governments within the region have discussed this. We've discussed with the psychiatric committees in the countries and so, and these have been major points of contention. The reason that governments within the region choose to go ahead with some level of decriminalization and eventually medical laws is because of the benefits and risks of the entire holistic approach. Putting people in jail, putting young people in jail, the cost of to the society, all the stuff that we heard from our former Attorney General in 2019 for the whole year, right? And those benefits have been observed within our country, within the legal system, within the cost system. I don't know when the people will see the benefits of the cost, but that's a different discussion. However, it is important to understand that in as much as, again, another political party said the age should be 25, and all these things were discussed because it's agreed. The brain actually physically shrinks with use of cannabis, right? You can show MRI images and prove to young people. This government, along with other regional governments, promised, especially this government within the 5 public consultations we did under the former AG's office, to make public education one of their priorities, and we have not seen one element of public education. Yuri is responsible for education at the Yuri, but Yuri is not responsible for public education. However, Yuri should use its voice to push the government to engage in the public education that it's been promising since 2019 and since we've had all the public consultations. Because now, as we've seen through a number of the presenters, there's a number of products being sold online, through social media, targeting, for that matter, young people, right? And with no testing being done. However, testing is going to start in the country very soon. Next week, we have a system in place for cannabinoids at least. But then what are you testing? We're testing illicit sold products on the illicit market. What's really going on? I have been adamant about medical over recreational as an approach for the Caribbean for the longest while. However, in recent times, I've seen that the consequences of a recreational approach is not bad, and we do have to consider the negative elements of an illicit market, especially in a country like ours, where the finances from illicit activities go to way more detrimental things like firearms and loss of life. In terms of the Intrepid study, I do have one quick point to make. You all did say that there are a lot of factors. I wish you all had used the time to investigate those factors, because again, I will talk about it after, but right, okay. Because coming back to, I just don't want the audience to mistake and think that, oh, cannabis is the cause of all this. No, we live in a country where life is lost on a daily basis. We need to ask those persons, have you suffered loss in your family? What are your stressors? Why are you using cannabis? And then we'd have a more holistic view, right, of the cause, the correlations, all these things, you know. So again, I am very appreciative for the university taking this approach, trying to put forward education, especially for young people, because it is necessary. Did have a few more points, but I know you're finished in terms of the law and stuff that, just to make sure everything was correct. But all in all, a great job, and I really hope to see more of this done. And again, use Yuri's voice to push the government to educate and to engage in the public education. Otherwise, what's it all for? And then, aren't we not concerned about the young people? This was the major point of contention in legitimizing it at some level. We need to push that public education, and Yuri, use your voice. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to thank the presenters and I thank the young man who did all that work into the legitimization or decriminalization of the marijuana. But there's something that still bothers me. My father used to smoke, and they used to tell you about secondhand smoking. I am seeing young couples with young babies, with the parents smoking marijuana. I have seen children running around and the parents sitting down smoking marijuana. What is the effect of marijuana, secondhand smoke of marijuana, and what's the effect on pregnancy when the mother decides to smoke marijuana during pregnancy? That is one. Two, I had a little discussion with somebody who has his recreational cannabis, and I asked him, how do you know what kind of weed you're growing? He said, well, if you smoke it, you'll know. But that is where we're at. And why are there no test kits? Is it legal to have a test kit? And all these questions, we should be able, because we are talking about marijuana and we are not able to define what marijuana is. And that is a problem. And we are also running into, there are some people just sitting, waiting on acres of land to plant marijuana when it becomes legal. And certain people are being denied access to the land. So we have to look at this in a holistic manner. But the secondhand smoking for marijuana, I want to know, how does this impact people?
And I would like to invite the presenters to share publicly information that would address that question, given that we are out of time. So I would like to warmly thank the persons who asked questions, the presenters, the online audience, and most of all, the team at the Department of Behavioral Sciences who worked hard to make this event a success. So a round of applause, everyone. Thank you all. So I'm told that refreshments are available for all those who are here.